Are you ready there? All right, chapter 11. To the ends of the earth. We sailed due east to replenish our water and food supplies in Ecuador for our further voyaging. We sailed along the equator in the uneasy intertropical zone where the wind was alternately calm, due ahead, and due astern. The currents, too, seemed undecided. One day they would be to the east and then the next to the west. Captain Smith did not like the unpredictable conditions, but the sailors aloft had few problems in the light airs, and Kathy and I were studying via the birds the rare conditions. So a consensus decided that we would continue our course for the 600 miles to the Andean mainland, barring storms or being becalmed. The birds were a wonder. They gradually found favorite roosting places, and two couples made nests in eave-like spaces where Sphinx could not reach them. Because, oh yes, Sphinx was the devil in the birds' little Eden. Or perhaps it was a slum to them. I didn't pretend to understand all that those birds knew. Anyway, these birds, and we came to call them all finches, these birds were a joy and a puzzling study for us. First, we saw pinkish birds chattering and yakking, wings fluttering in groups on one yardarm or another. We interpreted this as birds from different islands sharing gossip. They began to appear in places and in ways that none of us had ever seen. We had had a meeting where we laid out for all the non-naturalists aboard how lucky we were to have these birds as honored guests aboard. By this time, our animal communication had awed everyone. One pair of birds kept an eye on the crew's mess hall and galley. These Galapagos finches had little or no fear of us. That was from birth, we learned. We learned this from the whalers who had been on the islands before, once or twice. Charles Darwin had said the same thing about these birds. This pair of birds, one of the pair was always at the open window to the stern. The other would range up and down the long table, ignoring flying elbows and forks, and pick up and sample small morsels of each dish. A twitter would call the mate from the sentry post at the window, and both birds would nibble and chatter and pick at our food. They were studying us. Very funny, we all thought. A bunch of young, assorted male birds liked the head, as we called it, liked the head forward, where we sat and shat into the green sea. Don't ask me why. If they wanted to study our poop, it was no use, though I saw one chase a turd down all the way to the water. But one time I sat there a long time in you might say, a brown study, and a waiting finch pecked me on the knee as if to say, well, get on with it. But there was Sphinx, the cat. She had become bold enough to climb all the way to the crow's nest on the mainmast and lurk there, waiting for an unwary finch. Once I saw her leap and miss and slide backwards down a sail, making 4 rips in the sail. Oh, the sailors cussed, but they patched the canvas. One day, we found her growling and munching bones with pink and green feathers coming out of her mouth. Oh, no. Well, Sphinx's trial, Judge Catherine Hull presiding, was brief. Sphinx was told sternly to desist. She burped feathers. She was paroled. But the bereaved male of the bird that she had eaten, the bereaved mate followed her, singing at her and grieving. Now, readers, don't think we could read their minds very much, but glimpses came through, especially in dreams and reveries, like daydreams. It was enough to know that we were succeeding in our communication. One crewman, a whaler from Ohio, dreamed that he was back at his childhood home and the birds' songs had awakened him. He looked out the window and saw two cardinals playing and a robin pulling worms. Then the sailor actually awoke and saw, perched in his open porthole, a pink, cardinal-like finch, male, making sounds like the pretty boy, drink your tea, birds of Ohio. Was he practicing a new song? Yep, from the dream time. The birds sort of talked to us this way by signals, more and more. They were becoming our scouts, in spite of Sphinx. Freedom and Liberty, the peace dogs, seemed to learn after only one day not to chase or snap at the birds, which were all around, on the deck, on the sails, and so on. We also acquired an albatross. He was old, he was ancient even. Of course, we called him Mariner. He always and only perched on the highest spot, the topmost yardarm on the mainmast. He flew alongside of us in all weather. By the way, believe it or not one sailor could report having bird shit in his hair or on his plate. The birds very politely went aloft and aside to poop. There were some stains on the sails, of course, from where they rested at night. But they and we were friends. We hoped chicks would be hatched wherever we were going. Lolo, the Graces, and we collected special seeds ashore for them along the way when we were near shore. Cascadas fed Mariner on the wing. She would throw pieces of food from the galley door to watch the albatross dive and take them before they hit. The tortoises entertained and puzzled us too. When they came aboard willingly, everyone came aboard willingly, someone planned an experiment. Plants and cactus were gathered from the 4 Galapagos Islands, which we had received the elders from, the turtles that is. And someone put out in 4 piles on the deck these seeds and plants and cactus. On the deck where our turtles lived, all 4 were huddled by the stern rail. Slowly, they gathered around. Then all 4 clumsily sampled each pile. Sure enough, each huge boulder of a reptile settled down by the pile from his or her home island and munched spines. However, before finishing, each elder left some for her fellows, and all 4 sampled each pile again. They were learning just as we were. It was fascinating. Sometimes all 4 seemed to form a line like an arrow, almost as if pointing out something to us. We learned soon to put a spyglass to the points that the line marked. The first time we did this, one end of the line of tortoises, I should say. The first time we did this, one end of the line pointed to a suspicious small stationary cloud. Lolo said it was almost certainly an island. The other end of the line, however, pointed to a smudge on the horizon, which resolved into a black cloud over a very large, active water spout. We paid attention to the tortoises thereafter. One night, the tortoises were restless, moving about on deck. Awakened, I went on deck. All around the ship, for a quarter mile or more, was a huge glowing wheel in the sea. It had 12 spokes that must have been a quarter mile long. They swept around clockwise, right around and under our ship. The turtles craned their heads overboard to watch it. In all these years, I have never found an explanation for this, but I have heard other sailors mention the same phenomenon. We felt blessed, especially, to see it. Now, don't think, readers, that we had easy telepathy. It was very sporadic, and sometimes even illusory. Animals put us to shame with respect to telepathy. It's easy to them. They don't lie. That's why. So say the Australian Aborigines. In Ecuador, we made a brief stop in Guayaquil, a port city, for fruit and meat and flour and water, drinking water. And then we hopped from fishing village to village, south to a little place called La Libertad at the Peruvian border. These were rather sleepy, charming towns, but home to repressed people, where lighter skins dominated darker ones, and birds were only good for eating and shitting fertilizer on rocky islands. There were good mangoes present, however. As we coasted slowly southwards, we all looked forward to Patagonia, in spite of the cold weather there. But further ahead lay the fog. That is, where were we going to go en route to Massachusetts? We really didn't know. However, one encounter in San Francisco I left out telling you. At this time, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was drinking rye whiskey, of course, in a rather sleazy but gossip-ridden bar in the Tenderloin section, next to a loud, scraggly older man who drank whatever I'd buy him. He spit when he talked and waved his hairy hands about wildly. This man was a construction engineer on the Western Pacific Railroad, which was then racing to meet the Union Pacific. The meeting happened in '69 at Promontory Point, Utah. This man, named George Black, called the Western Pacific the heathen Chinese line. Those chinks, he said, those chinks take opium breaks for 12 hours. He brayed and spat at me. I asked him for his weirdest story, and he obliged in spades. Near Lovelock, Nevada, he'd supervised an excavation for a trestle over a dry wash. Suddenly, all the Chinese workers, the coolies, as he called them, suddenly the coolies all fell back, afraid. Some actually ran away. And there George Black saw 4 large rectangles of flat stones placed on edge in the rectangle. Stone boxes without top or bottom. Each tomb had a skeleton. All 4 skeletons were over 10 feet in length. The skulls had 2 long hair braids apiece. One head was gray, the other 3 were reddish. Two of the bodies were covered with copper, small plates, which had been tied together with leather. One body had scraps of possible leather plates. One, the gray-headed body, about 12 feet tall, had a covering of plates of mica. George Black leaned toward me. Guess what? He spat. Inside the mouths were 2 rows of teeth. Ha ha! I said, what happened to the bones? He said, oh, some city slickers from Washington came out and took them all. They were from something called the Smithsonian. I never heard of them. Have you? Those boys were liars and thieves, plain and simple. I knew it. Never heard of them bones again, have you? At the time, the Smithsonian was only 5 years old. They learned fast how to lie and conceal things. No, I hadn't heard of those bones, but Indian Bob had, our cook. Indian Bob had heard of them. His people, the Arapaho, known as the Blue Cloud people, he said, came from the south. They were kin to Pimas, Papagos, and Paiutes, even to Aztecs. He didn't know. But from the northern Paiutes and his Arapahoes, he'd heard of these red-headed giants. They ate people. They wouldn't stop. All trading emissaries that they sent to them were murdered and eaten. Long warfare took place. Finally, the tribes, led by the Paiutes, defeated and killed the last of these mighty warriors. The red hair disturbed my mind because of my Irish ancestry, but these giants could not have been Celtic. Could they? Uneasily, I recalled, again from my ethnography class at college, I recalled that red hair sometimes cropped up, and was cropped, in very short Australian Aborigines, and also in normal-sized Easter Islanders. Were there connections? In any case, here was another case of forgotten genocide. Did it solve anything? Well, perhaps it did. Was this like our Civil War between the states? Well, for the time being, let's grant it. In that case, the score, just wars, 1 or 2. Unjust wars, 1,000. Oh, war. George Black got very drunk. Finally, he said to some of my stories about the CSN Louisiana and the Vesta, "Well, hell, boy, sounds like you all ought to join them nigger living, loving Injuns down in Creek Country on, what is it, the Apalachico River." "What's that?" I shot back, aroused. "Oh, yeah, they got this crazy fort down there called Fort Jackson. It's full of poxy creeks, scarred up renegade white boy bandits, and murderous escaped niggers." Where is that?" I said. "Hell, I don't know. Will you buy me one more? I gotta go piss." He staggered off. I did too, shaken by more than the booze, because Arthur had raved of this place. Arthur Arbuthnot was a true friend of mine, though he was seldom in his right mind when I was with him. He was the oldest of our Southern dead, near 70, I suppose, and he seemed to be more ready for death than some. Oh, but he fought it. Yes, he did. He had malaria. It came out when he was weakened by trench fever. His right hand was mangled by a Yankee rifle butt. He had fallen from his dying horse and was reaching for his sword. And he had fever, burning fever. The quinine, which I sought in Gettysburg, was available, but only to Union wounded. The South was rife with malaria in those days, but the North was too in those days, especially in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and in Philadelphia. So Arthur, my wise Uncle Arthur, died in my arms after a long, long struggle, 2 weeks or more. I surely loved that wild, gentle old man. As a young man, unlucky in love, he raved in the night. As a young man unlucky in love, he had run away from home, near Mobile, to the vast swamps and hammocks of trees in the Apalachicola Delta. Huge old bald cypresses grew there with snake birds and hingas and egrets, black and white, crowding their branches. Every few miles along the muddy flat stream, clear springs of limestone-filtered water came burbling silently to the surface, making circular blue islands in the shallow, dark, muddy river. It was alligator heaven. There were snapping turtles, too. The bigger species was as heavy as a man. Cottonmouths, snakes floated with white mouths wide open. Huge ivory-billed woodpeckers screamed in the trees. Tidal marshes, sometimes just deep mud and quicksand, other times water 3 feet deep on mud and quicksand lying the banks. For miles on either side of the river, a man could never walk. But trees towered, sweet gums, magnolias, bald cypress, swamp oaks, other trees too. Arthur, muddy, scratched, and sick, after some time hugged a log at high tide and managed to float out onto the main stream of the river. Within an hour, he was found by a canoe full of Creeks and Negroes. They took him to a place on the east bank where no buildings were seen. but it looked as if a lot of alligators had beached there and departed. An ideal spot to hide traces of a boat landing. The elm bark canoe was lifted and hidden, and Arthur was led and helped to what they called Fort Jackson, about a mile, on a path which was corduroy, logs buried in mud, that is. The path was concealed when it was near shore, and had blind paths forking off of it. Some of the cypress logs underfoot were ancient. There was a concealed drawbridge near the far end. And there was a small stockade with 5 creek chickies nearby. This word meant an open house. There were open houses like we saw in Maui, that is, with a thatched roof and poles and walls made of mats. Some of them had raised floors. Inside the stockade were 2 log cabins for sleeping and kitchens. There was a blacksmith's forge, a wood shop. There was a wagon shop, coopers, and a leather tanning. There was no distillery, but there were apple trees and a hemp field. Horses were being herded outside. There were corrals, corn and bean fields on piles of sludge from the swamps. There was a whole town hidden from all the eyes of men, unless the Frenchman Montgolfier's balloon or the Yankees' balloons could fly there. A whole small town. Arthur, around age 25, was entranced. He set to cutting and working the wonderful cypress trees all around. By the way, the cypress wood especially resists resists wet rot, like their relatives, the California redwoods. But even underwater, Arthur built log cabins for the settlement, learning from a large black man and many feathered Seminoles and Creeks. These 2 tribes, by the way, were really only one tribe. Creeks had always adopted many outsiders, and the color of skin mattered not at all to them. Arthur said, on a good night for his fever, that the people there had fought and lost to, and then hidden from, that hard rod of punishment, Old Hickory, Jackson, in 2 Seminole wars in the 1818 to 1824 time span. These people were not going to surrender. The name of the place was Fort Jackson. Why on earth, Arthur, I said, was it named Fort Jackson? Jack, he replied, son, I hope someday you can meet people as brave and as free as those. They named their place after their worst enemy as a taunt, daring him to find them and destroy them. Even then, son, they had moved their camp once. They could do it again, they told me. Their leader was a man called Bowles, William Bowles, a white man who could speak 9 languages that he'd own up to, but he knew more, that fox. The Creeks elected him chief of the whole tribe because, they said, he was the best liar they had ever met. He always wore a cavalier's hat with white egret feathers. He led missions of diplomacy to Cuba and especially to Haiti. The Jacksonites found plenty of support in some of these places. And then Arthur said, but I don't know, Jack. He was getting tired, getting delirious again. It's hot here, so hot, so hot. Oh, the vultures. Oh, God. After a moment, he said, look for Bowles, Jack. If you're ever down my way, you'd like him. I caught malaria there. He slipped away. 3 days later, he was gone, all but his hat. But his story remained in my heart. As we coasted slowly southward, we entered uncharted territory. Somehow neither the Louisiana nor the Brilliant, nor the Japanese, could provide us with a chart south of the Peru-Ecuador border. The rebels joked with us, it's too close to hell. We might need that chart. But they really didn't have one. In Guayaquil, we bought one in Spanish, of course. It was all right, south to Arecibo, I think, but it was way off, farther on, and it only went to Santiago, Chile. The brilliance chart couldn't be spared. The two sister ships had only one, but we had studied it, and Captain James Smith had been to the Straits of Magellan many times. Still, we hit a rock off the border of, it was then, I think, Peru and Chile. There was some minor tiff over that, as you'll see, about whose territory it was. Anyway, we had to put in to a tiny fishing port, which the harbor was stinking of fish guts and bird guano. It seemed there were sunken ships with guano cargoes scattered about the port. The port, if it could be called that, was oddly damaged, and broken hulls lay about. We wondered about this. Was it a tsunami wave that hit this place, I thought? Well, anyway, the crew had used 8-foot baleen pieces from the right whales, which were springy and nearly indestructible, to patch the hole in our hull temporarily while we were still miles offshore. We beached her, leaking a lot. The carpenters set to work, and I headed for the nearest and only cantina, Rosa's, for some tequila or whatever brew they had, and to hear more lies and boasts. One of my favorite occupations when ashore. This place was run by the Micheli family. Rosa had been their late mother. Now 2 brothers and a sister ran it. Papa had left for the silver mines. They were Bolivians, as a large sign over the door read, Cantina Boliviana de Rose. The sister clearly ruled the roost. She was extraordinary. Not young any longer, but no one would ever dare call her old. When a patron cheated at cards or pulled a drunken gun, she herself would rush to the offender, eyes ablaze, and tossing her head toward her brothers for aid, she'd grab his collar and frog march into the door and assist his exit with her sharp stiletto heel before Jaime and Roberto could arrive. She spotted me entering and kept a very sharp eye on me. She showed me to a back corner table in the gloomy, labyrinthine, old adobe building, which was half crumbling away. There I was joined by 2 garrulous magpies of Peruvians who wanted to buy me tequila. I acquiesced. My Spanish is very poor. Theirs was rapid and garbled by laughter, mostly at Bolivians, it seemed. After 1 tequila, a guitar started somewhere, and she came out to dance. The sister, she stamped a pseudo or real flamenco, which threatened to crack the old flooring tiles. She held her hands straight up with castanets. She whirled in a black dress, eyes always seeking mine, only mine. I wasn't playing, although she was only saved from a goddess's beauty by her prominent, proud, and bony nose. But her figure more than made up for this truly small imperfection, indicative of an indomitable will. I thought, I shan't mess with this jaguar. Just then, out of nowhere, she spun and stopped at my table, hands still raised. "Do you dance?" she whispered in English. "Never," I whispered back. Then, with a toss of her massive black hair, she was gone. After my second tequila, my table mates grew more talkative yet. Then I saw a lamplight come on in the dim far back corner of the cantina. Only I could see from my corner where she had seated me. Only I could see that the door of a small back room was open 6 inches or so, and within I saw a tin tub. White hands with red nails filled the tub with steaming water, and then she, someone very, very female, completely disrobed, and fussed over her bath as I watched a dim, steamy 6-inch stripe of her that kept bending over, putting in a toe, and so on. Now, 3 tequilas are too much for me. They were then anyway. I lurched away from the 2 vaqueros who never stopped talking and made for the pisser. But then I doubled back and to that little door. As I hesitated, should I knock? A wet hand grabbed my fist and pulled me inside. The lamp went out. I barely had time as her wet body enfolded me to whisper, Who are you? She whispered, I am Pachamama. Then she put her wide open mouth right onto my nose in the dark and said, but you may call me Maha. She breathed it on me. Maha is Spanish for a courtesan, not a streetwalker, but a geisha, a tyra. Goya's Maha was a duchess. Of course, Pachamama is the great earth mother. Her vagina is the entire universe, I think. This one was something else. Part Inca princess, part proud, pure Spanish Criollo from Andalusia, part Bolivian silver miner, part Italian immigrant tailor from Venezia. Her name was Marianna Micheli, but I only found out that after a black, hot whirlpool of passion that thrust me out. Oh no, I thought, what about Kathy? Well, readers, sometimes I surrender. A note from Robbie Gordon. By the way, folks, my ex-wife is named Mary Ann Mitchell. Her mother was Amelia Gallegos from Celtic Galicia. I'll return you to a Jack story now. She spoke plenty of good English. And French, too. Tavern keepers need to know what's going on, after all, and whatever she said was filled with fiery emotion, with conviction. I won't say that she had made up her mind on everything, but she wasn't interested in everything. Mostly in bed, she wanted a traveler's ear, and other parts, about her poor country's plight. My country has been stolen, she raged. Her little town, I still forget the name, had been until only 4 or 5 years before the one and only port of Bolivia. Now it belonged to Chile, or was it Peru? Los ricos, siempre, only, always, always. The rich ones, they took our whole sacred mountain of silver and made us dig it out. They beat us, they starved us, until the cerro looked like, what do you call it? A sponge, I laughed, as she squeezed an intimate part of me with such an item. We were in the bathtub again. And now, she said, they have a tin mine. That useless stuff. Only 100 miles from the ocean ships, but it is rocky, and they need a Yankee engineered railroad to get it. And in Bolivia, there are no ricos. No rich people, she corrected herself politely. There are only brown people like me, mestizos. Only a few pale criollos up in La Paz. No more Paz anywhere. The big ricos of Peru and Chile agreed to steal our port and sell our tin to Yankees. They made a war. After 5 years, the railroad hasn't come here and it's not going to La Paz, as promised, just to their cursed tin mine. Was the C.H. Hall Company involved? I wondered. I didn't ask. Now I understood the damage to the port, 5 years old. Yes, it's so good, so Christian of them, to show us poor brown people how white people can run their land better and leave a few crumbs in payment. Is Pizarro really dead? I was more in the mood for love than anger. I nonetheless found her flushed face and racing heart an aphrodisiac for this pale, mixed-up gringo. I was mixed up, but I could not stay mixed up with this woman, literally. Remembering my mission of truth seeker and my dim Latin American history, I asked a question to cool our ardor for a while. I said, what about, what was his name? Bernardo O'Higgins and Simon Bolivar. She laughed so bitterly. Oh, Simon Bolivar, that our country should be named for a man who left the job unfinished. Took the land from the Spaniards only to give it to the ricos, not to El Pueblo, the people. And O'Higgins? Yes, he freed Argentina and Chile. And then he refused to join Bolivar in freeing the whole continent and forming Los Estados Unidos de America del Sur. And why did O'Higgins refuse? Was he simply tired of war? Did Bolivar lose heart then? Sure enough, as I found on Vesta later, a Peruvian history book in English told me most sadly of the one and only meeting between the two great liberators, Simon Bolivar and Bernardo O'Higgins, where O'Higgins swore to return to his farm, perhaps. I don't know why. Perhaps he, like us at times, had lost heart that any commonwealth could hold power with justice over the rich and their racist tactics of division. O'Higgins, farewell. Bolivar needed you. Simon looked more and more like Don Quixote. Bolivar said of governing South America, it is like plowing the sea. I took Mariana to the Vesta for a farewell. She clung to me like a serpent of love. Kath and she glared, but I was unfazed. I still had a lot of good hashish. Does that make me a bad man, readers? I give up. Anyway, I was proud to show Mariana the wise tortoises and the gaudy painted whaleboats. We had started to paint the sails. Adam was in the lead, saying, God is great, God is great. He started with painting St. Francis and the baby Jesus in black skin. We had to hide now from warships and overly inquisitive merchants. But we caused a stir in several villages with our cheery birds, our pet mariner albatross, and our growing orchestra. Striped Lolo and the Graces did a hula for Doña Mariana. She cooed and breathed in my ear, Hasta la vista, mi corazón. We sailed. I was glad she hadn't begged to come aboard. One hellcat at a time is enough. Onward as creativity blossomed. Our money had bought art supplies of all kinds, rare herbs and spices for Cascadas and Bob to cook with, opium, incenses, medicines galore, books, kites, toys, funny hats, tools for woodworking, rare woods and stones, lapidary stuff, silks, fancy clothes for many, not for me though, saws, axes, shovels, flint and steel, rope and canvas, candles, and wines and beer and rum too, etc. Certain mushrooms of Oregon also. Lace began to appear all over the ship. Even a topsail had a whimsical skirt of Chantilly lace for a while. One whaleboat was painted to blend in with a jungle shore. One had mountains painted on it. The third whaleboat was all painted with icebergs. All three inside were painted paisley and garish tartans. Crewmen, many of whom were of Scottish ancestry, painted their tartans as street art everywhere, especially on the masts. Dress Gordon looked very good over Stewart. The masts looked like checkered totem poles. Wind-activated sculptures and toys anonymously sprouted up overnight, fixed to railings. We called them twittering machines. The birds were fascinated. Everything below decks was being gradually painted as more and more crewmen took part. By the way, the twittering machines were my particular creation. Everything below decks was being gradually painted as more and more crewmen took part. There were paintings of krakens, the sea monsters of Scandinavia. There were sea serpents. There was the Flying Dutchman. There was St. Brendan and his boat of red-headed monks. There were Thor and Odin. There were strange islands. There were beautiful nude vahines. There were mer people like we had seen off of Alaska. All these things appeared painted on bulkheads and ceilings. Also ships by Abel, who loved to paint ships. Also trees and herbs. There was a special room directed by the Aleuts. There, in Adam's best hand, and his whole studio's hands, were walruses, seals, caribou, wolves, brown bears, musk oxen, narwhals, belugas, black right whales, auks, and puffins. In front, a pod of orcas and a mighty polar bear were painted, with two cubs eating a seal, while orcas ate another seal. Dolphins were shown fleeing. All around were snow and ice and dark green islands. A glacial cliff loomed, calving icebergs. In one far corner, the Aleuts supervised the depiction of an extinct animal, the 30-foot sea cow or giant manatee. Above it all hung the great northern lights, and a cloud like a wolverine. The perspective was done so well that with the door closed, it was hard to tell by lamplight where the corners were. It was a magic chamber of Alaska, carried here in the hope of showing it to their long-lost relatives of the South. No people appeared in the picture by Click and Yak's request. They said souls were involved with pictures. Click and Yak sang and prayed there with a drum, which they brought out only when ice had been sighted. That was a great moment. That's the end of chapter 11.
Okay.
You want to take a
that
break?
That was great. Yes, please. That was such a great chapter. Boy, so many great
Wait till
ideas.
Wait till you hear the one that's about to come.
Okay. Yeah, I think your idea about being like, like...
Turn this off, would you, if you know how to do it.